Hello and welcome to CIMA's Roundtable, Managing Responsible Business, the Future of Ethics. I'm Nicola Marr, the editor of The Accountant, an international publication covering the accounting profession, and I'll be chairing today's event. Ethics is now as important to the health of a business as the financials, and in the wake of the financial crisis, investors and other stakeholders are calling for more non-financial information to tell the complete story of an organisation. Leading Management Accounting Designation CGMA has conducted a global survey on business ethics, and in this debate we will be looking at some of the most important findings. In this segment we'll look at ethics in education, the role of the finance professional and the influence of ethical standards and regulations. Tonya, the CGMA report found less than 20% of respondents are directly collecting or reporting on ethics, and it's most likely to be large organisations that are doing it. Why do you think the percentage is so low, and how can this be improved?
I think it's probably because the respondents to the survey would have come from different functions across the organisation. So although 20% is particularly low, 1 in 5 actually collecting and reporting on data, when we asked them the question in relation to their organisation as a whole, it was higher, and positively it has grown. So it's around 40% of organisations are reporting and collecting information. And if you look at the reporting piece, at companies that employ over 5,000, it was around 60%. So the good news you extract from this, there has been a significant increase since our previous survey. However, it's still not good enough. When we asked the survey respondents if they felt it was important to collect such data, over 60% agreed. Yet they didn't feel that the same amount of organisations would be collecting that information. So there's that mismatch. And I think what we can conclude from that, when we go back to the question of companies having codes of ethics, how do you know they're being implemented? How do you know what effect that they're giving you? And leading organisations will assess and audit this and can actually correlate to more positive results for the organisation overall. And until you start measuring and collecting this, how are you able to evidence and show that? How do you know what your position truly is?
Thanks, Tonya. Colin, I'd wondered, what is the role of business education in promoting both understanding and practice of business ethics?
Well, perhaps not unsurprisingly, the business schools have been soul-searching about this since the financial crisis. I think the business schools probably have come to the view that for many years they were emphasising shareholder worth and the growth of shareholder worth at the expense of other things. And that was partly a contributing factor towards the financial crisis. And I think now there is a recognition, actually coming from alumni and graduates as much as from faculty. So you have such things as the Harvard MBA oath, by which future managers promise to be ethical and good people. Of course, there may well be problems of implementation with that as well. So I think the business schools, particularly through organisations like the Academy of Business in Society, are actually now looking at how they can develop and help people develop an ethical approach to business. There are sort of technical problems as to how it should be taught. I mean, the classic one is, should you embed it in the curriculum so that students are absorbing it without even know they're dealing with something as philosophical as ethics, or should there be special modules? And I think academics like to divide things into discrete categories, and for example, we'll probably have modules on corporate governance which are quite separate from modules on CSR or sustainability and ethics. So I think the business schools have recognised they have a role. I don't think we've quite yet worked out how we're going to fulfil that role.
Okay. Do you think that actually at that grassroots level more should be done to promote the ethical behaviour?
Yeah, I think, I suppose what we try and do in business schools is to habituate our students and our graduates to actually incorporate moral and ethical and sustainability factors in their decision making. And I think we can begin to see, actually this has been happening for a little while, and we can begin to see that happening. I noticed that in the survey something like 39% of the respondents said that they took ethical considerations into account when they made strategic decisions. That quite surprised me. My gut feeling was actually in practice the figure would be a lot lower than that, because there's always the conflict between the sort of strategic imperatives of an organisation and the need to act in a way that fits your conscience. So I think the business schools are beginning to, well, I think it's not the business schools, I think the students are now more aware of these issues, or more willing to take them seriously and take them into account.
Okay. Margaret, obviously you work for a big four firm, KPMG, and I just wondered how it is that they actually deal with ethics and how they tackle that issue.
Well, at KPMG, they have a set of values that they manage by, and that's the way that they approach ethics, is by managing against those values, defining them, and then setting out what behaviors those values are in practice. And then, of course, at the throughout your work, you are kind of moderated against those, and how you are performing against those values. And so I think that, touching on what Colin was saying about education, you also have, there are many spheres of influence in how you act ethically. And your employer is one of those, certainly, and education is one of those. And I attended an undergraduate business program in the States, and they did have an oath that you took, kind of like medical students take, saying that you will act ethically. And we also had compulsory models on both business ethics and, more specifically, corporate sustainability. So I think those many spheres all have to be taken into account. So, of course, the ethics codes of your organization, your influence in developing your skills on being alert and identifying ethical dilemmas that you can begin learning in university, but then also in your own self and your kind of own upbringing and how your individual kind of moral code applies to that as well.
Yeah. Do you think that actually your business education equipped you to deal with ethical issues that came up, during your working life?
Absolutely. As I was saying, that we had compulsory models on this, and the approach was mostly a more academic but also realistic case study approach. So we reviewed many case studies that are published by HBS and other institutions, and it's taking those more philosophical and ideas and then seeing how they're taken in practice. And so it's equipping you with an understanding of there are ethical dilemmas and helping you to identify what those are, and then using your own core values and those articulated by your company and how you then approach those, and then following something that's congruent with your company policy on how to manage that.
And in terms of the guidance perhaps that you're given by KPMG or any other company, I mean, do you feel that you've been given enough when you're working with clients and that kind of thing to deal ethically?
Absolutely. I think there's an increase in firms, not only just in the ethical codes, but in having hotlines and offering trainings. Right. And even some firms have 24-hour counseling services. So you can call in, discuss with them. And there's also, some firms have monthly newsletters, and they're just one-page newsletters that come out and say, oh, it's coming Christmas time, how do you accept or not accept gifts? Or, very topical ethical dilemmas and considerations. So I think that there are lots of things in place, and you also have your professional bodies, such as CGMA, who are providing structure and support and are listening to, okay, how do you really implement and manage and help those, as we were saying in the previous segment that Nina brought up, was how do you actually help those people that have an issue take that step into addressing it? And there are things, especially CGMA has released scenarios on, here's a scenario that some of our members have faced, and how do we address those? This is how they did it. And it's kind of again, a case study on how do you assess and how productive that is for you.
Okay.
I think it's quite important. I mean, Margaret raised a very interesting point there. It's helpful to have that guidance and training. The one thing I found doing ethics across country borders is that a lot of the cross-cultural differences are quite relevant. If you start with an ethics principle, then you can allow for all of those various cross-cultural influences. So particularly with large global organizations, you will have different cultural starting points for all of those different employees, different professions, different disciplines. But if you have a code of ethics that is based on principles rather than a tick box exercise, and you give practical examples through the case studies, it means you're equipping people through that training process to reach their own conclusions. And in a sense, I was interested with what Simon was saying in how you implement ethics, how you deliver ethics. That ability to reach your conclusions is quite important. If you give the people the principle structure, they can work with that.
Can I just add to that? I think one of the issues that many big multinationals have a very macho approach to decision making. It should be quick, and you should not mess about, and you could go straight to the point and take action. But I think I agree with you. Actually, what organisations need is to give their people time and space in which to debate. Because really, looking at the ethical issues of a strategic issue means looking at something from different aspects and looking at its possible ethical issues and problems. And that takes time and space, which can sometimes be regarded as ineffective and inefficient in organisations.
Can I give you an illustration of how this... In fact, I was doing a focus group for a pharmaceutical company, American pharmaceutical company, in Moscow. And they were going through, they wanted to find out if their code was effective in a faraway place. And we got to a point about giving and receiving of gifts, and the company was very, very clear about this. And a chap got up and said, but wait a minute, we are looked upon as being very mean and horrible in this company, because on International Women's Day, we, in Russia, we exchange we give gifts to ladies, like flowers or chocolates, and we are not allowed to do it. And it does us more harm than good. And investigating this a bit, the company, I went to the company and said, this seems to be a problem. They said, well, the local head of the region has discretion on how that ethical principle is applied locally. And it turned out he wasn't based in Russia at all. He was based in another culture, and he didn't really understand or know about this. But giving that discretion on the application without breaking the principle is very important.
Looking at the role of the finance professional in addressing ethical issues, and I wondered, what's your view of you know, the role of a finance professional in addressing these issues?
Well, I think a finance professional is going to be a bit in the core and the central piece of the business, and so they get to see many business units and interact with individuals. And I think that drawing a bit back on the debate with Jeff and Nina is that I agree with you both, and I think that there's a continuum though, and it depends on the size and maturity of the organization. I think that there are front leaders that agree with you, Nina, that operate like that, but I think that there are also companies that lag. And I think that people turn to the accounting profession to expect them to kind of bring up the standards throughout organizations. And so finance professionals are looked at having to have a code to abide by and to act with integrity and to be objective. And so there's some type of moderation that they have to do. So they're not just the number crunchers, but they're also going to be a bit of detectives, not just the financial accountants, but also the management accountants, because they're reporting internally.
Okay. Jeff, in terms of, sorry, I just wanted to touch upon, I guess, monitoring the use of these ethical standards, and does more need to be done?
Does more need to be done? I think a lot needs to be done.
And by whom?
Well, I think it's interesting. We're talking about ethical standards coming from business, and that's what we're talking about here. Obviously, ethical standards in the main come from civil society, and civil society will normally set the standards by which businesses, which are adaptive organisational norms, they work. And I think, therefore, civil society has the biggest role in monitoring business. Now, a lot of that has come through the advent of CSR. And there are not that many accountants, unfortunately, who have taken up the cudgels of CSR. And we talked years ago about the ethical spine that the management accountants should be seen to be placing. And I think that's a huge responsibility on management accountants, who are there to be much more than number crunchers, who are there to actually evaluate and translate for other people how an organisation is doing. And ethics are part of that. But I think civil society, the NGOs, the government, has to play a huge role, and that has to be continuous. Businesses will adapt, in my view, rather than invent the ethical issues. I think businesses will, if they've got the right people in them, be hugely responsive and can provide leadership. But it's at the end of the day, I certainly believe civil society has the role to play.
And that's what's going to drive change in business. And I guess that's some of the issues around the companies I'm sure you're alluding to on the FTSE 100 and around the world. They're not in the public's eye. If you're in the public's eye, you're going to get that media attention, and you're going to have to change your habits. And that is beginning to even happen in China, that Chinese population will look at certain companies, you know, the baby milk scandals. But if you're operating 2-3 steps away from a consumer and you're able to make big bucks and no one's going to come down heavy on you, yeah, these are real issues, and it's very, very difficult to know how to control that.
And I think employees too, and potential employees, are now asking, who are good, about the ethical and value stance of the organisation. And they don't want to work for organisations they're not proud of. And Shell will give you examples of that they didn't get the best people after the years when they had a very bad time in Nigeria and the North Sea and so on. So it isn't just coming from the general public, it's also coming from younger people who have standards and want to see that those standards can be maintained in their business.
Because I really resonate with that, because a large number of the people that I work with, not just within my employer but outside, what you find is that they know which companies are doing well, are efficient, are effective, and are handling things in the way that they would be proud to work for. And that information flows again through social media real time. Domino's Pizza had a problem with its pizzas. It was on social media within half an hour, it was sorted. Everybody knows that was the response. BP had an issue in the Gulf. Everybody was watching, and clearly the response is, well, BP should be doing. So yes, it might come from civil society, but you can guarantee there were other companies in that sector watching to see how BP responded, so that they would then adjust their particular programs to make sure that they didn't get caught with the same type of questioning. We have in the UK a whole heap of media attention on phone hacking, and it's because there is now judgment going through an inquiry, but you can guarantee there's a lot of press comment and a lot of blog comment. This is what I would call an ethical response, not just from civil society, but a whole range of comments, and they're impacting the corporations that they're working on.
Media has a role to play, essentially.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. I wanted to touch on integrated reporting. It's a really, really hot topic at the moment. Integrated reporting, the integration of financial and non-financial information into one report. Tanya, do you think this can help bring more focus to these non-financials, such as ethics, to ensure that companies are actually taking that longer view, that longer term view?
Absolutely. Companies are beginning to now track non-financial data within their organisation, which, you know, a really simple, obvious example is employee engagement, how people are progressing through the organisation, gender split, how people feel engaged with day-to-day work, and how that actually then translates to value. Is becoming, these are the things that aren't necessarily simple to deal with. They're not clear numbers, but it's beginning to be understood as more and more important to be able to tell the health of an overall organisation. Now, what we can see is growing and pushing that even further is some of the more insightful investors, not all of them, but they are a growing group, will now be looking at those non-financial aspects of an organisation. Why? For the long term. So we've got brilliant examples, you know, the poster child of ethics, Enron. You can see there was returns. So if you were just investing in Enron on the basis of the next quarter returns, great. If you're going to really dig deep into that organisation as to what was going on, how the governance was operating, you know, the fact that they weren't paying tax for the last 4 years of their existence because they weren't actually making real money, there's a lot more coming out than what was being shown on the balance sheet. So the non-financials been able to drag in different areas. Where are you keeping your employees? You can tell hot shots without your operations globally. You can tell what products are really selling well and how your reputation will actually add to consumers being attracted to your products and goods. It's a complex area, but it is absolutely vital.
So Colin, how are ethics being integrated into performance management and related reporting?
Well, I think the honest answer is I'm not quite sure, because it is a very complex area, but I think there's a number of issues that need to be addressed. The first one is simply, how do you measure the integrity of an organisation? You know, the range of things you could actually put numbers on is vast. their validity is not always transparent. And of course, as in all performance measurement, cherry picking is a great temptation. But I think the other problem is the balanced scorecard problem. You know, so okay, we used to have the 4 quadrants of the balanced scorecard. I suppose now we've got to find somewhere to put another. Can you have a 5th quadrant? You can't really, but yeah, stick an ethics quadrant in there somewhere. And okay, I'm sure organisations do, and they will publish those metrics. But the problem is, I suspect very often, even with the balanced scorecard, they had the numbers, but they never actually focused on balancing the different things. 1 or 2 of the quadrants always took priority. And it actually comes down to an issue of priority that's being given to the ethical considerations. I suspect, because I come back to the theme that being an ethical organisation is about giving people space to debate the issues, I suspect the real place for ethics to be incorporated in performance management is in the individual performance development review, or to use an old-fashioned phrase, appraisal, because that would be an opportunity for people actually to talk about the complex dilemmas and issues that people face. And I've no idea to what extent that happens, and maybe that would be a good research project. Is that opportunity to discuss ethics taken up?
Measuring ethical performance is as you say, a real challenge. The companies are now saying that surveys of both staff, customers, even suppliers on a regular basis, together with exit interview information and so on, begin to give you an indication of how the culture is actually working as opposed to how they would want it working. But the thing that really upset me, but going on, was the way in which companies over the last 5 or 6 years have separated out their annual reports, a separate report. It can be called corporate social responsibility, where they report about ethics. I'm now looking at all annual reports across my desk to see what they say about ethics. For instance, numbers of calls and content of calls on speak-up lines and so on. There are indicators that you can have, and they need to be there in order to get the total picture of the organisation.
Perhaps instead of asking the insiders what they think about the ethical health of the organisation, I think Management Today publishes an annual survey of Britain's most admired companies. So in other words, you ask the competitors to rate each company on its ethical performance. So but even so, in the end, you can only measure the problems of compliance that are known. What you can't measure is the problems of compliance that are not known.
The other problem is who actually is looking at the reports. I did a lot of work in the last 3 years with pension funds, and maybe 1 in 50 pension funds take these reports really seriously and evaluate their investment decisions on the basis of very long-term ethical considerations. One example that was raised to me, for instance, was BAE Systems. When it had a bribery issue, their share price rose against the market the following day. In other words, shareholders looked at bottom line considerations only, didn't take into account those ethical rules. And pension funds that I've been working with have great difficulties because they have so many other issues to consider in terms of the long-term performance of a stock or of an industry sector or whatever it is. And it's very difficult to evaluate non-financial data in that way.
Thanks. So from our discussion, it is clear more needs to be done on reporting of ethical practices within an organisation. There is also a need for more education at grassroots level to help instill ethical behaviour as corporate reporting evolves in the next decade.
The AICPA and CIMA require that their members follow their respective institutes' code of ethics in order not only to ensure that their organisations, but also the public are served with utmost integrity. Through the CGMA website, you can access not only your code of ethics, but also a range of resources and tools, as well as support to ensure that you are acting ethically. Visit www.cgma.org/ethics.